For that, in the components folder, I'll add a new subfolder. I'll name it demo. And in there, I'll add a new file, and that's my demo output.js file, where I import React from React. And then here I have the demo output, where I get props. And I export this as a default, of course, so that's a standard component. At least it is as soon as we return JSX. And now I'll take my paragraph here. This is new. Remove this line here from the app component and add it instead here as the return value. To be precise, I'll do something slightly different now. I will not conditionally render my own component or not, because it should be obvious that this will behave like rendering the built-in paragraph component or not. Instead, inside of demo output, I'll change the HTML structure a tiny bit. It'll not just be this paragraph, like this. Instead, I will render this text in the paragraph conditionally. And I will render it conditionally based on some data I get through props. So that I can check if props show, for example. So if the show prop is truthy, let's say we expect a Boolean here, so if it is true. And if that is the case, then I want to render this is new. Otherwise, I will render an empty string. So the paragraph element is always rendered, just the text changes now, based on the show prop. So now back in app component, I therefore want to include my demo output here. So make sure you import demo output, of course. And there I want to set the show prop, because we use that show prop in demo output. And the value we pass here should, of course, be show paragraph, because that is a Boolean. It is false initially, and it's changed to true if we click the button, and then back to false, and so on. So now this component here is always rendered, and in the component the paragraph is always rendered, but the text that's shown, that will change based on the show prop. So now if I save that, let's go back. First of all, if I click this, you see we got basically the same behavior as before. There is no great difference. Now if we expand our DOM here a little bit, we see, of course, that the paragraph is always there. But again, if we click the button, we see that the paragraph flashes when I click it, and it flashes again if I click it again. The reason for the paragraph flashing is that we now only work with that element, and we add or remove the text. And this is treated as a change for the entire element, which is why the paragraph flashes and not just the text. Because the text is basically like a prop to the paragraph, you could say. It's its content. But again, it's just a paragraph. It's not the H1 or the button element. So the fact that we're using a custom element, a custom component, does not change this. And of course it shouldn't. The updating mechanism should always work by comparing differences. It is, of course, interesting to see that we are changing state in the app component, and yet only the paragraph, which is part of another component, flashes. So this, of course, proves that the React updating and diffing mechanism works and finds out changes correctly. Now, one other thing is also interesting, though. If we go to the console, and I reload here, you see app running, and you see that, of course, runs whenever I click this button. Now, keep in mind, the actual change happens in demo output. But of course the app component runs again as well, because that's where we manage the state. And I mentioned the component where you manage state or where you have props or context and that state, props, or context changes, that component will be re-evaluated and re-executed. And we are managing the state in app. So just because the change visually only affects this paragraph in another component does not mean that the app component is not re-evaluated. Of course it is, because there we manage our state. And that's, by the way, also what I meant earlier with props and context, in the end always coming down to state changes. The props we got in demo output are of course responsible for why demo output is re-rendered. But ultimately, of course, the value we get here on the show prop is the value we manage in the show paragraph state. Ultimately, it all comes down to state and state changes in React. Now, it of course should be obvious that if I now add a console log here in demo output, that we'll see this being printed for every button click as well. We see it initially because that component is rendered initially. And then if I click toggle paragraph, well, we again see demo output running for every click. And again, that makes a lot of sense because the props changed with every click. So thus far, this hopefully all is pretty clear and pretty straightforward. Now I'll show you something that might be confusing. Keep in mind that demo output running is printed for every click, and again, that makes sense because we do change the state and therefore the props here with every click. But now let me tweak this. In app.js, I will now hard code the value I pass to show, and I will set this to false. This means that will never show the output because it's now detached from the show paragraph state. Indeed, I'm not using the show paragraph state at the moment. I'm still changing it, but I'm not using the state value. Now, what would you expect as a result? Let's see. If the app reloads, we see app running and demo output running. Makes sense, the app just loaded, both was rendered. But something interesting happens when I click toggle paragraph. If I do that, you see app running. Okay, we changed the state there. But you also see demo output running. And that's interesting. The props didn't change, right? We have the show prop, and the value I pass in there is still false. It never changes, it's always false. So why was demo output re-executed? Well, let's take it step by step. The app function is re-executed because state changed there. Now what is part of that app function? Of course, this return statement, and there we return some JSX code. Now all those JSX elements here in the end are like function calls to the respective component functions. So we call the function for the demo output component, we call the function for the button component. That's why those child components are also re-executed and re-evaluated just because the parent component changed, because they are part of the parent component's function body. And if the parent component function runs again, of course the child component functions also run again. So in the end, the prop value doesn't even matter here for this component to be executed again. It's just the fact that the parent changed. Changes in props might lead to actual changes on the real DOM, but for the function to be re-evaluated, it's enough that the parent component was re-evaluated. Of course, the fact that demo output runs again does not mean that the real DOM is touched. We can verify this with elements. There, you'll see that nothing flashes. I can hammer that button and nothing changes there. Because React just re-evaluates the components, and as you learned, re-evaluating a component and rerunning its component function is not the same as re-rendering the real DOM or manipulating the real DOM. But it is really important to understand that if a component is re-executed, all its child components will also be re-executed and re-evaluated. So therefore, of course, not just the demo output component is re-evaluated, the button is as well. If I console log button running here, you will see that if I go to console and reload, we see all three outputs initially. And if I click this toggle paragraph button, we also see all three. So the button component is also re-evaluated as well. This, of course, brings up one question though. Here we have a very simple app, just one root component with two child components, which then each don't have any more child components. If they would have child components, though, those child components would also be re-evaluated. Of course, and I can show this to you. If I add a my paragraph.js file here, where I essentially copy demo output, but I then simplify this, and here I have my paragraph also as a component name. And then in there, I just output a paragraph tag with props children in between. I can use my paragraph instead of the built-in paragraph, and I'm really just doing this for demo purposes here to show you how React updating works, not because this would be such a useful component, it isn't. But now with that, if I add my paragraph, which replaces the built-in paragraph, just to then reuse it, if I add this, you of course will see in the console that my paragraph running also is re-executed for every button click. So this continues down the component tree, and this brings up one important question. Isn't this bad? Because if all those component functions are re-executed, that's a lot of ongoing function executions and virtual comparisons that certainly cost some performance, right? So isn't this bad if there actually is no reason for that? Because we know, for example, that we never need to re-evaluate demo output because it can't change. The only prop which it has is hard-coded. If it had no props at all, we also would know the output in there will never change because of the state that's managed in app component. So re-executing demo output and all its children is a total waste.